anytime, any day. Why not right now? Stop looking up to your boss and start being your own boss. Don't work for paychecks. Work for dreams with no regrets. This is Cracking the Entrepreneur Code. If you have the passion, we'll create the blueprint. Now, your host. You know him from his 7 tips to build the business you always wanted, and now you're about to hear a lot more. Jack H.M. Wong.
Welcome to this episode of Cracking the Entrepreneur Code. And I'm your host, Jack Wong. And I have the privilege and honor to have a very successful serial entrepreneur who is also an author and speaker, and his name is David Barnett. To just give you a little bit of who David is. He's been working with small and medium enterprises for over 20 years. I wanted to say 2 decades, okay? 20 years, and he has been an advertising consultant, a finance broker, a business broker, and currently he's helping people buy and sell around the world as a private transaction advisor. And David has already written 7 books about small business and local investing, and 3 of which have been Amazon bestsellers. Invest Local, Franchise Warnings, and How to Sell My Own Business. How are you, David? Thanks for being my guest on this show.
I'm doing great, Jack. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, first of all, I want to say that when I received the bio from David, I will say, oh my. It is kind of, I have no reason how on earth we can attract David to be on the show. And it's always been our privilege to have people like you, David, who are successful in what you do. And we really want it's actually my own agenda. I want my audiences to learn how you are so successful. So I will start asking a very simple question. It might be simple to me, but I do not know how you handle that. That is, how do you start your business in the first place?
How did I start my business?
Correct. How do you start?
Well, it's interesting because when I look back over my past, I can see different points where I felt that I was more successful. And there were different points when I didn't feel as though I was very successful at all. And so what I'm doing today in helping people buy and sell businesses, it actually, you can turn the clock back to when I was a finance broker, because I was arranging commercial debt and other financing vehicles such as factoring facilities and commercial mortgages for businesses. And the financial crisis of 2008 occurred. And what happened was a lot of the companies that I was going to get money for my clients, they went out of business during that financial crisis.
Yep.
And I realized that I had to make a change. And one of the things that I had seen so often when I was doing finance brokerage is people were looking for money to purchase businesses, and the deals were not being put together in a proper way. And the people who were trying to broker the deals didn't know what they were doing. Oh. So we had people like, well, for example, real estate agents trying to put together deals to buy a business. And they didn't understand, how to put it together properly. They didn't understand the financing. They didn't understand operating capital or how to treat things like, like outstanding liabilities with respect to gift cards or gift certificates, or how to treat inventory, that kind of thing. And so deals were being put together improperly, and people were ending up with bad deals. And so seeing that need in the market, I decided I would become a business broker. And I joined up with an international business brokerage company. And the reason I chose them is because they gave me access to training.
Okay.
And so I'm on the east coast of Canada, in a province called New Brunswick.
Okay.
And I was the first person ever in New Brunswick to be certified as a business broker. And so I was able to bring a higher level of professionalism to the trade here in New Brunswick. And in my business brokerage, I did that for 3 years. I sold 36 companies for other people. And so I was very successful as a business broker. But what the story doesn't tell you is that the cash flow of that business is terrible. When I was a business broker, I was basically earning a commission from the business seller when the business was sold.
Yep.
And even though I sold 36 companies in 3 years, there were 3 different periods, some of them up to 9 months long, with no closings. So imagine for 9 months, you're spending money on rent, your office staff, advertising, the budget at home, and no money's coming in at the top. And so it was very, very stressful. And if you look at my photo online, you'll see that I have gray hair on the side of my head.
Yes.
And all of this gray hair comes from that time of my life.
I see. Well, thank you for being honest, because there's always the other side of the coin. Some entrepreneurs, they like to just show their good side and never reveal the other side. And thank you for being honest. To me, that is a true character of a successful entrepreneur, being able to stay vulnerable and tell the truth. So thank you for that.
Well, it all culminated actually in a very, very stressful time. At the end of 2011. I had 6 deals lined up.
6 deals.
That were going to bring 6 deals were going to close, and they were going to bring me $250,000 in commissions. And by the time the year ended, one of those deals fell apart because a bank rescinded a funding letter.
Okay.
So they had promised to make a loan and then they pulled back. A second deal fell apart because a franchisor treated the buyer disrespectfully and the buyer backed out of the deal.
Okay.
And a third deal fell apart because it was a regulated industry and the government agency which regulated that industry wouldn't issue a license to the buyer.
Okay.
And so 3 of my 6 deals fell apart, and it had nothing to do with the buyer, the seller, or me.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized I cannot plan a future in an industry with all of these forces that can create problems for me.
Yeah.
And so that's when I got out of business brokerage. It was almost a year later. My phone kept ringing, Jack. People were calling me because I had built a reputation for helping people buy and sell businesses. And my phone kept ringing. And finally I said to someone, look, I'm not a broker anymore, but I can help you. I'll have to act like a consultant. And that's how I eventually started working as a consultant. It began as a side hustle. And then within a year became a full-time thing. And now I've been doing it for almost 3 years. And I work with people, largely people in North America, UK, Australia. And a lot of that is driven by my YouTube channel and some of the things that I do online.
Okay, so you do have a very interesting story to share. And at the same time, realize that how you started your consulting business, right? This, like, what are you doing right now is a result of there's demand coming in because you have built over the years the reputation and people understand you, people know your capability, and that's how you do what you're doing right now. So to me, sorry, continue please.
Well, I was going to say the other interesting thing is that when I was a business broker, my business model was based on me earning commissions when I sold a business for someone. And the whole time I had that office, there were people that would come and talk to me, and they would learn about buying and selling businesses, and then they wouldn't do a deal with me. And so I wasn't able to earn money from those people. And what I realized later is that was the market trying to speak to me. These were people who were trying to learn. And it was only later, after I got out of business brokerage, when my mind was opened to understanding a different way, that I realized that people don't necessarily want someone in the middle who takes a piece of the deal. People want guidance and advice, and they're willing to pay for it. In much the same way that you go to an accountant for help with your tax forms, or you go to a lawyer for help with a contract, people will pay for competent advice. And so my business today is simply based upon people coming to me to help them through the process of either buying or selling business.
That is why I said, like, in my consulting business, I totally can relate to this, because you just hit the nail of the thread where I'm actually doing tax consulting. And if I want to just providing tax filing services to my client, the proposition doesn't last long for one reason, because everybody, anyone, any CPA can do the job easily and with the less cost. So why do they need me? So for us consultant, one of the challenge that I'm facing in the early part of my consulting business is, how do I stand out? How do I add value so that my clients appreciate what I do and but be willing to work with me on a very trust basis? And that's how I can command a much higher consulting fee than normally a consultant. I'll call them an ordinary consultant who have charged. So running a consulting business initially wasn't easy. I mean, to grow it is already very difficult, but to stand out in the intense competition, because I bet that we have so many people doing similar things in our industry. So how do we stand out? How do we make ourselves distinguishable, and how to gain the trust and confidence from the client so that they decide to use us is always a challenge. Do you see this kind of things happening in your industry?
Well, I don't see a lot of people doing exactly what I'm doing.
Okay.
What I see in consulting in general, though, is I see a lot of people out there who call themselves consultants, but really what they're doing is they're being freelance workers. So maybe they're in the computer industry where they're doing programming, and they're just working for an hourly rate. And so there's not really much there that makes them any different from an employee.
That's right.
Just that they're temporary. And so what I've often had to show people, and what I implement in my own consulting practice, is I create products. And products are treated very differently in the minds of a client. Right? Here's one of the big things. When you hire someone to do a service, typically they do the service and then you pay them. Right?
That's right.
But if you go into a shop to buy an item, you pay the shopkeeper and then you take the item. And so if you can create products that people see value in, they'll buy the product. You end up with no receivables. You end up with being able to specialize to the degree where you can do the same thing over and over again for people very efficiently. And it means that even though you're delivering great value for the customer, it's taking less and less of your time to actually deliver the end result. That's right.
It is a very interesting concept because in the accounting industry, primarily, I don't see a lot of this productization. Happening. At least from my Asian perspective, I didn't see much. It's still a very intangible activity, which you do require consultants to go to the companies, spending their time and charge based on time cost. So I heard you very loud and clear that this, to your definition, is not really the consultants that you are talking about.
Because once you can create a product, then you can create a procedure.
I see. Yeah.
And so then you can create, here's our desired deliverable. Here's how we get to it. And once you've got all of this organized, and here's the biggest thing of all, Jack, once you've got all that organized, you can then teach somebody else how to do it.
Exactly.
And once you can teach somebody else how to do it, now you have scalability in a consulting practice, which is the thing that so many people have trouble getting to. They do work for other people, and the only way they can grow is by having other people with the same skills and knowledge come in and do the same work.
That's right.
And then they start working off of a spread. And that business model is the exact same business model that, you see down at the auto mechanic shop, where you pay a certain amount for labor and they're paying the mechanic less, and the owner of the shop is trying to make his living off the difference. And the problem with that is that your skilled people can always just leave at any time. And you end up with turnover problems, and if your business may have value, but the only value that's there is in the work that you have booked for the future. And if you were to sell a business like that, the buyer is going to insist that you stay on to realize all those contracts. And they're going to tie the value of the business to that effort.
So it's like, in other words, you can't leave the business even though the business might have been sold to the other person. You are not replaceable.
That's right.
Yep. It is the worst nightmare because when I first started the consulting business, my own definition of consulting business is, I provide a consulting service to my client. And I always found that at the end of the day, wow, I'm so busy with my work because, like you said, it is really like trading time for money. It's no different from working in a firm as an employee versus working as a freelancer. It's only like in the last 2-3 years, I started realizing one thing. Well, I can't keep on doing what I'm doing. So I've started creating templates for my own tax consulting work. And these templates are based on my experiences that work, that has been working, that has proven result. And I started actually teaching clients how to implement these templates. So it's kind of like, I'm selling a product with my coaching and my training on them to empower my clients to be able to use them. So to me, I do not need to spend a lot of time like before, and the clients feel empowered and they feel that, okay, Jack is actually doing something unique because other consultants won't do that. So to me, I only came to this realization in the last 2 years because it's not an easy thing to do. It's a how on earth where we can create product. It's like, what product are we talking about when you're running consulting services? It's not easy.
Well, and what you're talking about creating a system that other companies can apply internally. What's great about that kind of thing is that it becomes a product that you can license to people.
Exactly.
So you can sell it for an annual fee, for example, and you can show people if you implement my system, this is the expected outcome for you, the savings, and the fee, of course, is much less than that, so you get an advantage. And if they ever decide down the road they don't want to do it anymore, then you can take it away from them.
Yep.
And so it creates this long-term relationship, and it's not just a relationship with an accountant, it's a relationship with you.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
And that repeatable subscription revenue, that's what's going to give your business true goodwill value. Because a buyer who comes along and buys your business, they're going to acquire that intellectual property because of the subscription revenue attached to it. Yep,
that's right. So it is kind of like, while we are really providing a service, but we still have to understand at the end the impact on productization. And one thing that just struck my mind was, okay, product can mean something that is an intellectual property. It is a product which you can license for a fee, or you can actually sell it as an asset. Whichever way, it will free your time. You don't need to worry about continuing trading time for money like before. So this is actually the next phase for every consultant who is listening to this podcast episode right now. You've got to understand that if you don't do what David has mentioned, you're forever working like a slave. It's just a matter of you are working in a different environment, but you still own the job. So this is a very loud and clear message to those consultants right now. When you're struggling, when you find that you're so busy, you have no time for other things, this tip itself, this insight from David is really like diamond. So thank you for David sharing with this piece. Really impactful. And honestly, for me, I can speak from my own experience. I didn't really know this kind of productization. It's just like by chance, that like the Singapore culture that we have here, Singaporeans for some reason are very systemized. Partly because how the country is built by our founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and he likes system. He likes people to follow certain ritual or path. So people are so used to this thing about systemization, about following step-by-step processes. So I just say, hey, if you talk about system, if people like system, people like to follow certain steps, would it be possible to implement some of these things in my consulting business? And that's how I got this aha moment 2 years ago. And I found that people are very receptive to this. And that's how I started doing more and more on this. Without that realization, I will probably be still doing what I started, how I started, like trading time for money. It doesn't work that way. So this is how my story goes as to how I come up with all these templates as products. I want to talk about the key crux of this interview, because you talk about helping consultants to sell the business. So in the first place, when you help clients to sell the business, what exactly the buyers are looking for in a business?
Sure. Yeah. Buyers are only looking for one thing when they buy a business. They're looking for cash flow.
Yep.
They want to pay money to you in order to secure a stream of revenue for themselves. And so what that stream of revenue looks like is different based on different kinds of businesses. So if you're talking about a little corner shop, which has always done the same level of sales for many years and has always produced the same cash flow, people will agree that the cash flow will likely continue, even though you don't necessarily know your customers. They're just people from the neighborhood that stop in to buy things. when you get into more professional services, then the relationship becomes more important. An extreme would be a construction company where the value of the business at any one time is really based on the book of contracts that they have coming up.
Yeah.
Because if there's no new contracts beyond the next year or so, then no buyer is going to be willing to see that there's any more money coming. Right. And so it all depends on how likely it is for that stream of revenue to carry on into the future. So if you have established clients that are repeat clients, that is the most reliable form of cash flow. So an accounting office that has a book of clients where people have been coming, 90% of the clients come back every year for tax services and things. This is seen as a very reliable source of revenue.
Yeah.
But if you're just working time for money, then there's not a great margin in it, right?
Yeah.
And so that magnitude of that cash flow is going to be quite small, and then therefore the value of the business is going to be quite small. If you can create an advantage, so for example, if you license your system that people use internally in their companies, and once you teach them how to use it, it takes very little of your time to support. Now you're talking about a stream of revenue with very little cost associated to it. So you've got a high gross margin revenue stream or product where people subscribe to it. Now you're talking about both a secure revenue going into the future, which is also a high margin revenue.
Right.
And that is very attractive to a business buyer, and it's going to earn you not only a bigger price, but a higher multiple of the cash flow. Because the more secure the cash flow is seen to be, the less risky it is, the higher the multiple is going to be when somebody puts a price on that business.
That's very interesting. It's all depending on what type of businesses we are talking about. Like, I am familiar with the accounting and the tax services. This is where I came from. It's like we always put a lot of values on this thing called the client's database. Because if you have a very huge database and that produce revenues consistently, that in Singapore terms can command a decent valuation to start with. So this is something that I can attest to. So talking about the other part of the transaction, which is the seller. I mean, at what point the seller will consider that the business is ready to be sold? Like, what are the steps for the seller? If, let's say, the owner of the business right now is thinking of letting go of the business one day, at what stage of the business can the owner say, okay, I'm now ready for this business to be sold? Like, at what point can the seller think that way?
Well, here's the interesting thing is people think about retirement.
Right.
And people also think about maybe making a change. When I owned my business brokerage, though, the top reasons that people came in looking to sell their business were these. And the number one was burnout.
Okay.
So fatigue. Okay. So someone's overworked themselves. They become bored of what they do. And if a person had a job that they no longer liked, what they would do is they would go find a new job, and then they would quit their job they didn't like, and they would move on. Right?
Yes. Yep.
But when you own it, you can't do that. You need to sell it because a lot of your family's wealth is going to be tied up in that business.
Yep.
After that came poor health. So a disappointing visit to the doctor who tells you that you need to move on or become less active, or maybe you have an illness. Then comes divorce.
Oh, okay.
Then comes relocation.
Okay.
And so we're seeing more and more in North America is we're seeing a successful entrepreneur who's married to another person who maybe is a very successful employed person. So maybe they're a military officer or a doctor or something like this. And if that successful employed person gets transferred, then the business will end up going up for sale. Right? Because the couple wants to stay together. And so we've got poor health, we've got burnout, we've got divorce, we've got relocation, and the last one was retirement. So out of the top 5 reasons that people ended up wanting to sell a business or needing to sell a business, only one of the 5 is planned for. The other 80% of the time, people were not planning to put their business up for sale. And so that's why it's so very important when you are building your business, you need to get these things in place, systems, processes, procedures, products in place as soon as you can, because you need to be running your business at all times as though it might go up for sale.
Yeah.
Because the things that can push you to need to sell your business are sometimes things that you never expected.
Yep. This is very good. This is a very important point, as one of my coaches actually talked about it one time. I remember it's 2012. Wow, that was like 6 years ago. He said the reason why I start my business is to sell it at a certain point in time if I choose to. So that means your business must be structured in such a way that it can be sold one day. So how do you do it? Well, systemization, making all the process ready, that's very important. And David, it doesn't matter what businesses we are talking about. All businesses are a result of people and systems. So systemization is very important.
Yeah, it's critical.
It's critical.
And people, customers put value in systems.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I point out all the time is the fact that, McDonald's does not produce the best hamburger.
Nope.
Everybody knows this.
Yes.
But what they produce is the same hamburger.
Yes.
Over and over again.
Yes.
And so when you're traveling to a new town and you're not familiar with the restaurants and you want something to eat, people will choose the expected over the unknown.
That's right.
And that's why they walk into a place like McDonald's, because they know what it's going to taste like, even though it's not the best.
Exactly. That's very, very interesting thing, because in America, when I ever go to America, it's 10 p.m. There's nowhere else I can find food. The only two places I always go to, McDonald's and Denny's, because I know how they taste like. This is confirmed. I will not be very surprised. And yes, the food quality is okay. It's so-so, but at least I know how it tastes like. So yeah, I'm totally with you. And the other questions that I have in my mind is that, like, for the buyers, when they look for buying a consulting company, and you mentioned that the buyers are looking for a cash cow, looking for income stream. Like, do you experience, have you got any experience in your assignments in the past, like the buyers who are able to raise capital? Because I'm a very big fan. I want to study more on this thing about raising capital. It's like, I want to buy a business, but I don't want to fork out my own cash. I want to raise the capital first to fund the purchase of the business. Like, what can the buyers do, or how do the buyers do to raise the finance so that they are able to pay for the business?
Well, and when you buy business, money always comes from two places, from you and from the seller.
Yep.
And in some instances, it comes from a third place, which would be a bank, or you could also put other investors into that category.
Sure.
So, and here's, this is one of the big things that a lot of people aren't familiar with. Because a successful business will have a certain component of its price be goodwill. This is the value of that cash flow. It's not tied to tangible assets, which means that a bank is not going to make a loan unless there's some sort of government guarantee program. So in the United States, they have something called the Small Business Administration, which, guarantees these loans. And so in that country, people can actually borrow against goodwill. But here where I am in Canada, it's not the case. And in most of the world, it's not the case.
Definitely not in Singapore too. Definitely not in Singapore as well. So if you buy a business and there's some equipment and machinery, a bank might lend you a certain percentage of the value of that machinery, maybe 50 or 60% of the machinery. So as a buyer, you put some money down. The bank will maybe advance a little bit of money, and then the seller is asked to finance the balance, which means that the seller has a vested interest in the success of the business. And this is really critical because the buyer often wants or needs the seller's support through training and transition. Right.
And so now the buyer and seller, after the deal closes, they both have an interest in the success of the business. If you buy a business and you pay all cash, the seller now has no interest in helping you because he's already got his money and he's going to walk away. So I have a little bit of experience through stories. I met a business broker from Hong Kong once, and he was telling me that in Hong Kong, very few of the sellers are willing to do vendor financing. And as a result, what happens is that the buyers will only agree to a price that takes into account all possible risks, which means that the businesses are sold with a risk discount. And what the sellers don't understand is that by not financing part of the deal, they're eroding the value of their own business. The value of anything is underpinned by the availability of financing. I always say, how many $40,000 cars would be driving around if there was no such thing as a car loan? And the answer is far fewer, because very few people will save for that much time and then write a big check for a car.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's much easier for a person to say, okay, I'll pay $500 a month versus saving all the money and writing a check. People value the money more when they save it up, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't have the ability to save it up. They need those financing terms. So if you can't borrow money to buy a business, then the value of the businesses themselves will start to decline because no one can buy it. And sellers will often say, if they're going to sell a $100,000 business and the buyer wants them to finance, the seller will say, well, we just need a buyer with more money. It doesn't work that way, because the people who are trying to buy a $100,000 business are people that have $25,000 and they're trying to use leverage to buy the $100,000 business. People with $100,000, they don't want the $100,000 business. They're trying to buy the $500,000 business, right?
Yeah.
Everyone wants to use leverage to get something more. It's the same reason why people use mortgages when they buy a house.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
They want to put a down payment and get a much bigger house, and they'll use the bank's money as leverage to get the nicer home.
Yeah.
So the vendor financing component is critical because it also provides a method for guaranteeing that the buyer can trust the seller in all of his disclosures before the sale. Because a vendor financing often includes a clause which says that the note, the debt, is subject to offset in the case of a material misrepresentation or an undisclosed lien. So if the seller is lying to the buyer about important information and the deal goes through, then the buyer has recourse because they can then go after the seller for damages. And guess what? They can offset the amount that they owe them in the future, which creates an incentive for the seller to be honest and trustworthy.
That's right.
Right.
I enjoyed this conversation, really. I really enjoyed it. Yep. You have anything to add before I move on?
No.
Okay. So I really enjoyed this
structure.
Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation because to me, while I fully understand, I can safely say that Jack understands what Dave is talking about, because from my background, I understand all this lingo. I mean, in my old firm, I was involved in millions of dollars of M&A deals, so I fully understand that. I was just wondering, like, for the market, like the SME business owner, the small and medium enterprises owner, do they really understand this kind of conversation? I don't know. How do you feel?
I think that they do, because when they come across this information, it makes a lot of sense. Right.
Yeah.
And they understand immediately why it makes sense for them as a buyer to set up a deal in this way.
Right.
And the sellers also understand, because, at first glance, the sellers often say, well, it's risky for me to lend money to a buyer. But when they realize the position that they're in, and I'll give you an example of what can happen. If a buyer is not successful and can't make the payments to the bank or to the vendor, what that means is that the vendor can then foreclose on them and take the business back.
Okay.
And don't forget, the seller received all the money from the down payment and all the money from the bank loans. So the seller has received, in most cases, a big portion of the overall amount of money, and it usually takes a few years before things go bad. So they've also received payments on their note. And if they want to, it's not an obligation, it's an option. The seller can foreclose on the buyer and take the business back. Well, that means they get to take the business back and they can build the business back up again and sell it again. So in a worst case scenario for the seller, which is a default of the buyer on his note, the seller can actually come out further ahead by being able to sell the same business twice. And so when buyers and sellers are both brought up to speed on the reasons why we structure it this way and what the advantages and disadvantages are for both, it makes sense. And so in all the deals that I've ever worked on, there's only ever been one cash deal ever.
One,
and it was,
okay.
There's only been one. And it was because a business was marginal. It wasn't very profitable. And the purchase price was basically an amount of money for the machinery and the inventory.
Oh, okay.
So there was no goodwill was being purchased or anything like that.
No intangibles.
So that was a cash deal. Every other deal I've ever worked on has had the vendor financing some part of the deal. And it's to give security to the buyer that they're not being lied to. And I often say to people that if a vendor refuses to do any kind of financing, it means one of three things. It either means that the seller is simply ignorant of how businesses are sold, which they may be, right?
Yep.
Because people don't sell businesses every day. Or number two, it means that the seller has no confidence in the buyer. They don't believe the buyer is capable of running the business. Or number three, it means that they know that they are being misleading and that they're giving incorrect information or they're omitting something important from their disclosures. And reason two or reason three are both very good reasons not to buy a business. And so I tell people, if the vendor is not willing to finance some part of it, it's the biggest red flag you can ever notice about a business.
Right. Wow. Sounds very, 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 very useful tips, useful information. And thank you for sharing. So towards the end of this interview, I always have a ritual of cracking the entrepreneur code. And by asking my guest, what's the number one quote that he or she would like to share with our audiences? So David gave me this one. And he said, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. So how does this quote apply to you?
Yeah, well, I see it all the time when I look at the financial statements of businesses. People will be in a business and they will ignore certain indicators that show that they're not doing well.
Okay.
And you know, from your accounting background, Jack, you've probably seen some of this before.
Oh, yes.
So they will pretend everything's going okay. You know, they'll continue to take the same salary. And what you look at is you look at a series of balance sheets, for example, where the long-term debts are going down because the bank has an amortizing debt. But the short-term liabilities are increasing over the same period of time.
Yes.
And the person keeps taking the same salary. They keep treating the business as though everything is okay. And one day, so they're ignoring reality. And then one day, all of a sudden, the credit card is declined. And this is the consequence of ignoring reality. And you can no longer ignore it at that point because the consequence now is real. Yep. And a crisis is usually what ends up happening because somebody's been ignoring the facts.
Yeah. And sometimes it might be just too late to salvage the situation.
Unfortunately, sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for really sharing your insight. I mean, I enjoyed very much about this conversation. Honestly, I have learned something about the true consulting business and this vendor financing concept. Yes, I was aware, but I couldn't elaborate or explain in the way that you have just done. So thank you for enlightening me on this. For people who are interested in knowing more about your services and yourself, like where can they go to check you out?
Well, the number one place on the web to learn more from me is at davidcbarnett.com, and that's my blog site. And from there, they can find hundreds of articles and videos and links to my YouTube channel.
Okay.
And links to the sites where I talk specifically about buying or selling businesses or the work I do. I do help people systematize businesses as well. And I have an online course that speaks specifically to that challenge.
Right. I'm sure my audiences would love the systemization part because most of them actually know the concept, but you ask them to implement, they get stuck. They do not know how to do that.
Yeah.
It's very typical, but that's why guys like you are here for a very good reason. So I truly want to thank David Barnett once again to share with us his insight and experience on this show, on this episode. And that concludes the episode of this particular one. I mean, of course, in future, I'm still doing my best to bring on another successful entrepreneur, whether it's a man or a lady, doesn't matter. I'm going to ask another successful entrepreneur to share with you guys the insights, the tips, the wisdom, and the intelligence so that you can all learn and have your business taking on to the next level. So once again, thank you very much for listening. And this is your host, Jack Wong, and I'm going to sign off now. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
To continue cracking the entrepreneur code, subscribe for more episodes and download the Amazon bestseller, Cracking the Entrepreneur Code, 7 Tips to Build the Business You Always Wanted at crackingentrepreneurcode.com. Learn more about author and host Jack H.M. Wong and book your 30-minute discovery session to overcome any professional challenge at jackhmwong.com/apply.